Fabulous. So hello again, everybody, and welcome to the fourth series in our deep dive around the circle webinar. And tonight our webinar is actually on the achieving dimension. So we now begin our journey around the creative half of the circle, having spent the last three webinars in the reactive half of the circle. We have gone through the protocols already, and as mentioned during the webinar, there will be a few occasions where I'll actually stop and say, you know, any questions, any comments, and then towards the end of the webinar, I'll actually mention the next webinar, which is next month. It gives me enormous pleasure this evening to welcome our guests who will be joining me, and we'll be together taking you through some of the thoughts and ideas, and particularly a case study. So I'd like to really welcome and warmly welcome two people. Well, Gail I've known for a very long time, and Malcolm I've known for a reasonably short time, but feels like a long time. Gail Hardy and Malcolm Lazenby, who are co-founders of Global Leadership Foundation with deep experience in leadership and organizational culture transformation. And so welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eva.
It's let's have some fun this evening, and before we get going and starting on the achieving, what I'd like to do is, for those of you that have been on the webinar before, I will just very quickly go through, and especially for those that haven't or those that are logging in later, is to remind us that when we're looking at achieving, that in actual fact, the Leadership Circle profile and the Manager Edition, both profiles have the achieving dimension. And their competencies are the same, except that, and they're the same in some of the other dimensions in the creative, but in particularly in achieving, that the competencies are the same. The questions, that there are just fewer questions. So the structure we're looking at here is the structure that looks very much at leadership competencies in the creative part of the circle. And as all of you know who've been through certification, and that's why you're on this call this evening, that these competencies that are actually determine the performance. So that we talk about structure determines performance, and the creative orientation is a structure. It's an operating system that allows us to deal with greater complexity, greater ambiguity, be able to handle multiple stakeholder interests, and short, medium, long-term time frames. Our relationship with authority is different. And as a result of these creative competencies and the research that's been done, we know that these are essentially the behaviors and skills required for effective leadership and enduring performance. Correlations to leadership effectiveness and business performance are also much higher in the creative orientation, and of course in the reactive orientation, enormous gifts, enormous strengths, and when overextended or underutilized, competencies can usually be traced to some of the self-limiting assumptions that we have. How do we get in our own way? In other words, you know, what are the stories we tell ourselves, and what are the habits and the patterns of thought? Again, another operating system. Perfectly functions at earlier parts of our career, normally for most of us. And then when we are actually asked to step into a role that requires us to deal with greater complexity, multiple stakeholder interests, dealing with the unknown, this operating system tends to begin to reach its limits. And so many of us will hear, I'm sure Malcolm and Gail, you've heard this, many of us will hear leaders saying, but what I used to do that got me to where I was and was successful for me isn't working for me any longer. And so this is the structure that we talk about. Structure determines performance. And in the leadership circle profile, we have 18 creative competencies, 8 inner circle dimensions, and 11 reactive styles. The distinction with manager edition is that there are 12 creative competencies, 6 inner circle dimensions, and 9 reactive styles. And as you well know, that when we talk about structure determines performance, one of the ways that distinguishes the leadership circle from most other frameworks that are available is that it points to adult stages of development. And the leadership circle doesn't measure them, but points to these adult stages of development, which is another way of saying how complex our complexity of mind, the breadth and the depth of our capacity to be able to deal with things, make what we were once subject to, like my identity, that once upon a time for me personally, and as I still get hooked by it occasionally, is that, that I am very task focused and very results and very achievement focused and also highly perfectionistic. So occasionally my perfectionism kicks in and it's like suddenly my identity gets caught up in, oh my gosh, what will happen to my reputation or the brand if the standards aren't always extremely high. And so it's learning to deal with those structures and understanding where it serves us and where it doesn't serve us. And so we get performance. We get performance, we get results, whether we're in the reactive, whether we're in the creative, or whether we're in the integral. The difference is the pattern of results over time. And this evening we'll be talking about specifically around achieving and what are the results that we actually can get when achieving is high, and what's the consequence when achieving isn't high. And of course, ultimately, this internal structure is the structure for, or the operating system for performance. It determines, the consciousness actually determines the effectiveness in the context in which we're showing up. So this next series of webinars is actually going to take us around the circle. And this evening, we are going to be spending time on the achieving dimension. And of course, with the achieving dimension, we have 4 competencies in the outer circle: decisiveness, achieves results, purposeful and visionary, and strategic focus. And as we have in the previous webinars, we're going to spend a few minutes now just going through, and I'd invite Gail and Malcolm for you to just, to have some insight, to share some of your insights and wisdom around, how individuals and leaders you've worked with that are higher in achieving, how they show up in different ways. And this is what we did for the bottom half of the circle, the reactive half of the circle. And so again, I thought we would keep this to a fairly common structure. And so starting off with what are some of the underlying drivers here, and when Bob Anderson actually created the leadership circle, as you would recall in certification and some of the conferences, if you've been to them, that the leadership circle, and what he did was he took apparently disparate fields of study and research and wisdom, and started putting together, I wonder if this goes with that, and how does this work with that? And so there are several people who have studied achievement motivation, one of course being David McClelland. And David McClelland looked at achievement, and some of the underlying on the theoretical underpinnings are that, for in those that actually have what is called achievement motivation, that the goals are meaningful and they're intrinsic. In other words, they tend to come from inside us, this preference for self-set goals. And they are, when achievement is high, they are short medium, and long-term perspective. So it includes all of those perspectives. There is also a preference for a moderate degree of risk with the desire to focus on influencing the outcome. So in other words, that I believe in cause and effect, and therefore I have responsibility and accountability for how things turn out. But I also am willing to take a risk in order to get the outcome and to actually get the result, because it serves a greater purpose. I also, when achievement focus is high, I also value and welcome feedback. That's what we often hear from leaders. Um, and they value and welcome feedback in order to monitor progress. There's also a great desire to make things happen and to follow through and to make a difference. And also having high standards of excellence for self and others, because there is this desire and this need for continuous improvement. Gail and Malcolm, anything you would like to add to that in terms of, your understanding of some McClelland's work?
Well, I think one of the things that we often see from the sort of underpinnings for achievement or motivation is that um, there's a high degree of belief that the achievement, they'll be recognised for their achievement and they'll actually gain sort of some recognition for it. So it's sort of almost like their identity is also wound up a little bit in sort of the success and achievement that comes together. So it sort of rolls some of these things you've already spoken about up together so that they are almost heavily invested in saying, I need to achieve to be successful as well.
Yeah, and that's actually probably a nice segue into the next slide, which is again a part of the basis for the achievement dimension is a lot of the work of Robert Fritz and Peter Senge, and that in terms of the creative orientation, the focus for the creative and particularly creative achieving is purpose, vision, and outcomes that matter. And they don't matter only to me. They matter to me because I've got skin in the game. They matter to the people around me, my team or my family or whatever, or whomever. And it's also about, as Robert Fritz talks about this, about bringing something new into being. So it is achieving for the greater good. I think, Gail, and Malcolm, we were talking about this, last week, you were saying that, there's also this sense of bringing others along.
And I think, Roma, that the last dot point for me, when we spend time with leaders that are truly creative in this whole area of achieving, there's actually a high relational behaviour that occurs as well. So
Yes.
This isn't about me. This is absolutely about the others that are with me and the benefit to them, the benefit to the organisation, the benefit for the greater good. And that's a real distinguishing characteristic of the creative achiever.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. So let's move on, because in the ideal world we can spend more time on the case study this evening, and then in terms of the mindset that comes with this an achieving dimension and this achievement motivation and this desire to make a difference, is that fundamentally that there is this mindset of abundance and trust that I actually can make a difference here. I and others can make a difference here. And so we play what Larry Wilson talked about, was playing full out, playing to win, and not at the expense of others, which is that highly competitive, ambitious streak, but playing to win in order to be able to achieve the outcome together, as bringing something new into being. So here are some of the mindsets that are embedded in the achievement, on the achieving, how achieving tends to show up with leaders. is seeing mistakes as learning, influencing outcomes for the greater good, taking ownership and following through. So here are some of the underlying beliefs, underlying mindsets, which are different, as you probably, or if you've been on some of the other webinars, you'll notice that in the previous webinar, the first dot point was not about abundance and trust. It was about scarcity and safety and distrust.
Roma, the other one that for me really shines is at the mindset around that getting to know doubts and fear, that there's a vulnerability here. It's not about knowing everything. It's also not about knowing the only way to go. There is that sense of, in achieving, I can continue to learn and I can continue to see what gets in my way. So there's a real openness to that vulnerability, that I'm open and willing to learn continuously in this space.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me of that, Gail, because if you've looked at the video or you were at the first conference in 2011, where Bob Anderson introduced the whole leadership imperative, and then the second conference was around, you know, the journey, what it takes to actually transform. And in the second conference, he talked very much about that, you know, some of the key practices for the journey, the shift between reactive and creative, is discerning purpose and vision, which is the fourth dot point, getting to know our doubts and fears, and engaging in courageous conversations. And in the achieving focus, the engaging in courageous conversations is for the sake of a better outcome, is connected to purpose and vision and strategy. If that makes sense. We will open up in a minute just for some thoughts and some ideas from you all. Let's just go through and have a look at physiology and how this actually shows up. Gail, Malcolm, any thoughts on this?
There's something about the body posture and non-verbals. There's something about the confidence that they have. So I liked what was in the previous slide where you sort of talked about empowering self, and empowering others. So there's something about that confidence in themselves and those that are around them that enables them, their body stance just sort of projects that. So it's sort of clear, but it's not rigid in any way. There's something about it being sort of confidence and solid, but not rigid.
And what we've got listed here is not necessarily, as we mentioned last time, is not an exhaustive list. I mean, there will be more ways that we will show up, that people will show up when they're high in achieving in terms of some of their physiology and body posture. Here are some of the ways that might manifest in a non-verbal sense.
I think the one that we spend a little bit of time having a conversation on was that peripheral awareness as well. That
yes.
There's some capacity in this physiology of the achiever that enables direct face-to-face, great eye contact, and at the same time still this ability to be seeing what's around you,
Yes.
and using that as a way forward. So it's a really interesting one. I'd be fascinated if there's some thinking around that from others in the group about whether they see that.
Okay, do we have any questions at this point in time? Just curious if anybody has any questions or if anybody has a comment or would like to. So we can keep going and we will keep asking if anybody would like to make comment or ask questions. At the moment I can't see any. Can you, Pauline or Judy?
No, I can't, Roma.
I don't see any.
No.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, well, we'll keep going. Let's come back to the internal felt sense. So as distinct from the physiology, what actually tends to be going on inside the beingness of those that are high in achieving. And again, we won't go through all of this in huge amount of detail, but Gail and Malcolm, can I invite you into having conversation and sharing your wisdom around the heart and the gut energy?
Yeah, absolutely, Roma. There's the gut energy is is almost the doing component. So it's this move to action, but it's also there's a gut instinct comes to play here, but it is also moving into action to enable everything to come about. So it's sort of what ends up driving the outcomes, but it's not without the heart, which is much more about intuition and connection with relationships and being able to, I'm going to say, literally sense what's happening with people around them. So that's like they're in tune. And I guess the other part too is that when they have those two parts activated, often there's very clear insight which comes from their head center. So they actually find that their thinking is much clearer. There's a lot of clarity and it's very succinct.
Beautiful. Gail, anything you'd like to add?
I think picking up on Malcolm's felt sense, it's always an interesting conversation when people say, well, how do you get that? How do you see that their gut energy is strong or they're connecting to heart? There's something about when they're in that space of connection, the point that Malcolm made about the succinctness and clarity of their thinking is really high. And when they're disconnected in either one of those other centres, they tend to, these leaders will say it themselves, they start to move into this sort of circular thinking that stops them from taking action. So it is quite interesting. We always think of athletes being in the zone, and I think we've got a great example last night of somebody who kept saying, you know, as a tennis player, I was in a different zone, and that's what we see in business. So it's not just in the sporting arena; it lives in these leaders.
Yeah.
And of course, then go ahead, Malcolm.
I think the other thing for me is sort of when we do have the heart and gut sort of connected and they're in sync, there's something that happens about, you know, that we say trust that I can manage whatever comes up. So it's actually not just about trusting themselves that they need to come up with the answer, but it's more like trusting in themselves and the collective of what they can actually enable as a group to be able to do it. So so it's more than just themselves. It's sort of a confidence in those around them.
Which is a lovely then natural segue into, well, how do they actually, you know, what are some of the emotions that are associated, you know, with those that are, you know, high in achieving. So this great sense of, you know, there's an excitement and there's an anticipation and a fulfillment, but also deep gratitude and appreciation, not only for, you know, the results and the fulfillment that we can achieve, but for others that actually are part of allowing that to happen and making that happen. And grateful for learnings, you know, seeing and being able to correct, you know, it's almost like that. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day who has spent a lot of time in their life, you know, achieving amazing what a lot of people would not have put themselves into a position to do. I mean, this woman was the principal of two really large schools in Sydney in Australia, and has gone on to do amazing things in the education sector, has very high aspirations and vision and purpose, and often says that, you know, that the journey now is about being aware or in action, actually being aware in action of consequences and thinking, connecting dots, you know, that are wider than, as you were saying, Gail, you know, just beyond the here and now, but also being present in the here and now, but also having that peripheral ability to be able to think short, medium, long term. So therefore, you can see why, with high achieving and high creative, that the operating system is a different kind of operating system. Our complexity of mind, our stage of development has actually morphed into and broadened into something that is far more capable of seeing what we weren't able to see before.
I think, Roma, there was sort of valuing accomplishments of self and others is something that's quite significant. So I think it's nice to point out, so when we look at the whole achievement spectrum, so looking at the difference between, say, creative and integral, so for the vertical levels, that when we're sort of in the lower part of the achieving, we might value more about our own accomplishments, but as we move into that integral level, then it's always about others as being a significant part more so than perhaps their own. So there's a much more holistic approach when we're in that sort of higher level.
Yes. Yeah. That true servant leadership starts to come through.
Yep.
Yeah. So if we move on from emotions and we then look at the tonality, and when we're talking here, we're actually speaking about voice. And we had a bit of fun with this one, if you remember. That it can show up again like this. Please take these as examples if you're on the webinar or watching the webinar later. That these are examples. I mean, clearly. The range and the volume and the timbre of voice can vary enormously. And yet we did have a conversation about, we felt that there was a sense of, steady fullness, and that whilst there is a measuredness about, okay, now we know what we're achieving, or what the purpose and vision is, what the strategy is. So we're measured in terms of articulating that and describing it to others. There's also a degree of flexibility that can come with this, which comes from welcoming and valuing feedback, because it's the understanding that it's a zigzag journey, that it's not often a straight line to the aspiration or the goal or the vision or the purpose. And sometimes there will be a bit of urgency in the voice, because if there is a sense of, okay, now we need to get this across the line, then the urgency can come in, and the commanding and that deliberate tone. Okay, let's go for this. Let's get there. And of course, then the language comes along with that. So again, I'll hand over to Gail and Malcolm if you would like to share a little bit about your experience of how leaders show up, with language, and then we might open it up again.
I think what's interesting for me is there's usually a context that comes with achieving language, where whatever it is that we're looking to do fits in a context. So often there's a precursor to the action that says this is the why. So this is how it fits with, as you've got there, the vision, the purpose, the strategy. It's not a command. It isn't about, okay, and we're doing this now and we're just going to do it. There is something about a context that sits with many of these people. So the call to action there's a reason behind it.
Yeah, and I think the language, as a general rule, is quite it's quite positive and action oriented. We can see up there, we can, we will. So there's something very positive. It's not self-doubt. So you don't tend to see the words try in their language, or should.
Yeah.
Because it's much more
confident. Or maybe.
Yeah, or maybe. It's much more confident about, we can do this. And I think the words about, it is like we can improve as we go, and looking at in the longer term. But there's also a part about, actually it's okay for us to take some risks as well, and I'm going to say manage those risks, because I don't necessarily see them as just risk takers, but they actually are prepared to take managed risks that's actually going to achieve their goals.
Yeah, and to me, I think the words like effectiveness definitely start to come in, just this understanding that effectiveness, and performance. So those are the kind of words that, in terms of, achieving the results and the effectiveness that it takes and the choices that we can make in order to be able to, as you said, Gail, it depends on the context, and therefore, that flexibility and choicefulness about how I articulate things, and remembering that the focus here tends to largely be on the end goal, but it's not a goal for just today. If it's high in achieving, if we're high in achieving, it's short, medium, long term, it's the strategic, and of course, as you well know, that achieving sits just alongside the systems awareness piece. So it's that a capacity to then start to look across the system, in terms of results. So again, the focus is very much on the outcomes that matter, the purpose, the vision, bringing something new into being. That's where the fulfillment and the real juice starts to come in. So again, I will ask if there are any thoughts, any comments, any questions that anybody might have as we pause for a moment to invite people from the webinar to join in. Ah, hello, we have a question. Patrick, Albina. Hello, Patrick. Your question is, what would the physiological tonal differences be evident between someone in achieving space and the controlling space? Are you online now, Patrick?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, can. Yes. So, would you like to ask your own question?
Well, good evening, firstly. Being right next to each other, what would the differences be? I know we know them from an intrinsic motivation perspective, but I was quite interested in the sort of outward appearance, behaviours, those things that you went through. What differences might appear outwardly between someone in the achieving space and the controlling space?
I'm sitting here.
The really short answer to that is we did a webinar on it, so I would recommend that you listen to that webinar. And because we went through all of these elements. And a slightly longer answer is that, as most of you would remember, when we're talking about high controlling is getting results, and it's driven by the reactive compulsive tendency that I must, I should, I have to, or else something bad will happen. And so I won't go into all of the different physiological things, but the energy is much more, it tends to be much more felt energy. It's much more obvious and quite often overt and quite often a pushy sense of energy when controlling is extremely high. And of course the language will change because it becomes much more demanding and commanding and controlling. And the internal drivers are different, Patrick. And so I would invite you to listen to the webinar on controlling, because it goes through all of these particular elements. And I hope that's helpful for you. Gail, Malcolm, anything else you would like to say?
I just had, there's a real pickup for me, is if you look at the tension in the body, and particularly in the face and particularly in the lips, someone in high controlling, there's the lips are absolutely tight and the face is tense. So there's a completely different rigidity in the body with controlling. And then as a consequence, the language that comes out, the pitch is completely different because there's no relaxed pitch. The body is tense so that the language is tight, and the pitch is usually higher, and it's usually far quicker. So there's a lot more, I'm going to make this happen now.
And it tends to be, I'm going to make it happen now, because if it's to be, it's up to me, or it's my standards, or it's my way, or so the energy is about me. It's you know, it's that energy is less about we and much more about me. And of course, it comes from that sense of my identity, my safety, my well-being is actually tied up in proving that I can do this.
Yep.
When it's high.
Urgency.
When it's high. And of course, please remember, we have enormous gifts and there are enormous strengths in the reactive orientation when they're not dialed up, and when we're not doing them out of compulsive default behavior because there is a story running that something bad could happen to me if I don't do it this way.
Roma, I think there's also obviously a difference for the people that are working with them. So some of the words we used earlier, we talked about in the achieving space that people around them feel empowered, whereas
Yes.
from a controlling point of view, the tendency is that they tend to be disempowered. And I think there's a part of, in the achieving, there's much more of the we, you know, in the higher levels of achieving. Whereas I think controlling, it's much more about the leader as a, you know, I or the me piece rather than, you know, the collective.
Yes. And of course, some of that is covered off in what we've all been saying, is that the behaviors and our intentions tend to start to line up. You know, how we intend to show up is actually how we begin to show up. So, you know, this whole area around we lead by example, achieving results, which is not just about me, but it's about the team and the wider organization. Valuing and welcoming feedback and feed forward, and being strategically aware, so, and connected to the market dynamics. This is very much like on the business pointy end, highly associated with leadership effectiveness and business performance. We'll have a look at some of those correlations shortly. But this doesn't happen by accident. That it is intentional and it's purposeful. And so, and you know, the ability to get to the heart of the matter. Being on the front foot, being decisive, being willing to take a risk and you know, and be proactive, and even if it doesn't work out, well then that's okay. At least we learned, and we'll figure out, you know, another way to do it, and for the sake of continuous improvement. So there's I'm trusting that you're all getting a sense that, you know, that there is this, that with high achieving, there is a self-authoring that comes through, you know, and typically in the creative orientation, you know, the self-authoring stage of development is that, you know, that I have the capacity here to get some outcomes and to make things happen. And at the same time, we're not without being able to get hooked. So there are times that when something is at risk, how does a high achiever, or do those high in achieving get in their own way? And of course, the quickest way to get in our own way is when things are not being achieved. We're not achieving the purpose or the outcome, or we start to focus on the problem, not the outcome. Or we get so caught in the task focus that we start to let relationships fall away. Gail, you were talking about the next dot point. Focusing on what?
Yeah, what's interesting is when the relationships fall away, we see it constantly. It's then task oriented, totally task oriented. That
Yes.
it is about the how it all just not there.
I was thinking, Patrick, that to some degree, some of the things we're talking about here probably helps identify, that difference between the sort of achieving and controlling, and seeing how the two interrelate.
Malcolm, can you get a little bit closer to the mic, because you're fading a little bit away. Can you say that again?
Yeah, what I was saying is just I thought that from Patrick that what's on this slide here and what we're talking about is actually quite good from the point of view of helping distinguish between the achieving and the reactive controlling, and starting to see how the two differentiate, and how it's very easy when I start to not achieve and try and move into the controlling mode to actually try and make it happen.
Yes.
But then as a result of that, this ends up focusing much more on the what, and but things fall away. So you sort of lose empowering the people around you, and it becomes more about me rather than we as part of it.
So I wanted very deliberately to keep that in there, because as you mentioned, that controlling sits right underneath the achieving. So there's huge task focus and a real desire to get results. The difference is the way in which we get those results. And it's also the difference. One of the key differences in terms of getting the results is what are these internal underlying beliefs and assumptions. And this I actually took directly from the interpretation guide that we have, that you get given, and all your participants, all your leaders are given when they have their debrief. So I took this very specifically from the interpretation guide, and at the beginning of each of the creative dimensions, the descriptions at the creative dimensions, there is a description around what are the internal assumptions that are associated with each of those dimensions. And so page 49 of the interpretation guide actually lists the internal assumptions, and these are some of them. And of course there are a lot more internal assumptions. These are purely, again, examples of, I have a purpose and mission in life, and other people also have a purpose and mission, and they want to fulfill on that purpose and mission. And I am responsible, so I am this author here. I am the one who's accountable. So here are some examples of the ways in which, is it hardly surprising that people show up in a way with high achieving, when this is the internal dialogue, when this is the story, when these are the internal motivators. Gail, Malcolm, anything you would like to add on this slide?
I think what stands out here for me is and we'll come to it in the case study a little, is the top two. There are, in the achieving environment, when we hear people talking about their purpose and mission, it isn't necessarily always evangelical. It's not about, I'm out to save the world, but what's very, very clear is that they've reflected and thought a lot about it. And it may not be what we would imagine is highly significant, but there's a very clear picture about their own direction and what they believe they can impact on, and how that affects others and the bigger picture. So sometimes we just need to be careful when we look at purpose and mission, that we're not assuming that it's some giant crusade, but they're very clear about their own responsibility and what they're setting out to do.
Actually, that's a really great point, because one of the things that when people talk about, like purpose and vision and mission, is that, sometimes people who are practicing on this, and this is actually probably a lovely little segue into the next slide, which I'll bring up, and that is that people who are actually practicing or learning to extend or strengthen their achieving muscle, then an outcome could be that I am going to this meeting, and and I will actually show up differently in this meeting this time. Doesn't have to be, you know, the strategic imperative is actually achieved in that meeting. It's how I show up and the contribution I make, which is a stretch for me in this moment. That is achievement orientation. That is stepping into the shoes of achievement and motivation. It's how do I show up, and it's one step at a time. And so for some people, it's a huge leap to be able to show up differently. And so this is in this slide here is, which is the segue into the case study, is how do we meet people? How do we serve them? How do we work with people who are low in achieving scores? How do we help them show up? You know, and we think about how they might show up, well, it'll be the opposite of most of the stuff that we've been talking about this evening. And how best can we support them in that space? What is required of us as the guides and the coaches? And how can we help them get curious about their relationship to what achieving means so that they can begin to lean into it? So I'd be curious to open up to the webinar again and ask for any wisdom or insights, or how do you work? You know, what are your thoughts and ideas about how you can best support people who are low in the achieving dimension? Any thoughts, any ideas? Anybody would like to make a contribution at this point? Waiting, waiting, waiting. Can't see any. Can you? All right, we'll come back. We'll open it up again after this. But when I first had a conversation with Gail and Malcolm about and invited them to participate in this webinar, they very kindly said that they would love to do it, and were also very generously willing to share with us a case study of a client that they're currently working with. So what I'd like to do is to show you, there are two profiles that we have this evening. The first profile is a group profile, and the second profile is the profile of one of the leaders. And so Gail and Malcolm, I will hand over to you to talk through this group profile, which is a leadership team of 8 people, and to share with you some of the coaching strategies, some of the strategies, how you're working with this group, and what some of the imperative needs and the drivers are for them. And then when you're ready, just let me know and I can switch to the next profile for you.
Thanks, Roma. We'll just set the context, and I think then what we'll do is Malcolm and I'll just share insights as we move through. The context is, this is a deregulated industry, Australia-wide, highly competitive and low margins, very dependent on the weather. So it isn't, and of course in a world where our use of energy and consumer use of energy is changing, quite an interesting place to be in. The context was that within this particular organisation, this division was experiencing very low margins, a lot of competition, a lot of, in a sense, a lot of negativity to the industry itself, high level of consumers that they'd attracted, not necessarily seeing lots of great results on the bottom line. And a new leader into the business for around about 12 months when we started, with a real desire, very, very strong picture about making a difference. building this part of the business into something that was everyone could be proud of. Not that it wasn't achieving, but there was a lot more room for achieving. And the dilemma was, as we came into the situation, there'd been changes made, structural changes, different focus in ways of engaging customers, a lot more emphasis on the customer experience, and yet we weren't seeing necessarily or this leader, the CEO, wasn't seeing the changes that he'd expected. And as we moved into the conversations with him, and there'd been a serious amount of work that had already been done by the organisational culture team or the OD team, looking at what was going on in this area, what became really clear was there was a lot of waiting for things to happen. Much conversation. I think this is the organisation, if Malcolm and I had measured the number of meetings, there were people in back-to-back meetings for a day. And so what was occurring was that a lot of conversations, a lot of planning, a lot of things taking place, and the lack of translating that into action.
Yeah. So as an organisation, they really like to get together in meetings and have conversations, yet there was no real clear actions or outcomes that would come out of those. So there tended to be quite, and you can see by the profile, quite a lot of complying and also protecting. But complying in particular was, they'd often say there were things on their mind, but they would not raise them. They would sort of continue on the journey. And when you look at the profile and start to see that the achieving is sort of relatively low, that when you started to talk to people about, well, what is the strategic areas that you're focusing on, you know, what is your vision, and looking at all of those bigger picture things, as an organisation, that was not clear for many of the people that are there. So they're having meetings and going along, however, the organisation wasn't good at articulating this, and as leaders themselves, they were not saying, well, I don't understand the strategy, or I'm not sure what the vision is, I need to find out. Their own self-motivation was not such that it was driving them into that achievement mode. They were actually very much sitting back and complying with what the culture was requesting of them, and just going with the flow of everything else around them.
The other thing, and you can see from the protecting area as well, that there was quite a sense of siloed behaviour. So a lot of things happening within areas rather than across the business. And what was interesting for us is looking at authenticity. If you certainly look at the circle, you can see that of all of the areas, it's starting to become the higher one. And there'd been a lot of focus on the values, and one of the values happens to be really focused around authenticity, and another one around integrity. So what was interesting was that the work that had been done around being courageous in your conversations, being authentic in the way that you engage, maintain integrity, those conversations were happening, and people were seeing some of that beginning to occur. However, that was the one that was rising, rather than as a consequence of living the values, as a consequence of getting together and meeting and planning, that then something was going to happen. And you can see that the achieving side, that happening side, just wasn't there.
I think we should point out too that as an organisation, they had actually achieved a number like a number of really good things.
Yeah.
However, there's definitely a slowness to the process in getting things to happen. And this is where the CEO was sort of, I think he was saying, I want more. I want it to happen quicker. And I guess, but he was also, would recognise he was perhaps part of the issue that prevented that from occurring.
And I chuckled when we passed the slide, the language slide, where the language of an achiever is let's decide. The language of this organisation was what do you think? So you can really hear the difference in that languaging, and the complying relational side the relating side tended to be more of the way that we engaged, rather than, so it's what do you think, how do we engage everybody, let's bring everyone into a meeting, let's have everyone look at this issue, we need to do something about it. The language let's decide just didn't fit into that mix. Maybe.
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing is sort of in some of the things that have occurred since this profile and the original work was done, of course, is that as an organisation, there is been a much stronger focus, which is around the vision. So, the purpose and vision and what that actually looks like, and also strategic focus and being able to articulate it. So on one level, the organisation has taken the strategy, well, we need to be much clearer about that, and engage people in owning that. So it's not just saying, well, the senior leaders are going to tell you this is what it is. They've actually moved to saying, well, let's engage people in formulating and I'm going to say reconfirming in some cases the vision. However, they've done a lot of work on the strategic focus where they've really helped clarify, and there's some new things that have come out that they hadn't looked at, and so they've been much clearer about that and engaged people on that journey. So that's on one level that's been really fantastic, but there's also still been a little bit of complying by those because the culture was not that way before, so they're still having to learn to adapt and move into that new mode.
So maybe if we move to the next profile, to the CEO, and the really interesting picture here for us was we've got quite a strategic focus popping up, but what he said and what we were very aware of is that he was the one who believed he was driving this process. He was talking about, I do know where I want to go. I do know in fact, he has a lovely languaging around his strategies for his area. And so everybody had the words, and he was dead keen that he was going to make this happen. But there was something for him getting in the way. And as we started to explore this particular profile, the circle with him, one of the things that it became really clear was the high protecting. One of the things he identified himself was that he might have the language, and certainly he was, at least other people were hearing it, and they were seeing some of those action, the languaging around the direction. But there was also something about that sense of being a bit distant and a little bit arrogant around it, that what was showing up was someone who was on a mission rather than someone who was on an engagement focus. So that he was definitely moving forward, but not necessarily engaging people in that process.
So when we asked him the question about who's driving the strategy and who owns it, and it was much clearer it was him, and that his team were to a large degree doing what he wanted. They owned some aspects of what they were doing, but tend to be much more operational rather than the strategy and purpose. So he recognised that he needed to do much more about engaging them on a different level. So, but however, just because the organisation engages them on a strategic focus and revisiting and reconfirming the vision and purpose, that's not necessarily enough to move his team as leaders into that space.
I think the other thing in our conversations with him, and we shared this with you the other day, is one of the things that's most interesting is in that purpose and the vision and purpose, the looking forward, the strategic focus, there was still a tendency to be organisation centric. So what was occurring was we were focused on our customers, on who we were delivering the service to. We weren't necessarily thinking outside the scope of the organisation. And that really shows up, while I know we're not talking about systems awareness, there's such an integral piece in if you're going forward with purpose and vision, it needs to be in the context of something bigger. And yet the conversation was, oh, the community's not in our portfolio though. That's different. We've got people looking after them. So you could see that there was a limiting thinking process going on around what was achieving for him. And again, the sense of it's bigger than just my division. It's bigger than what I've got here. So Malcolm's comment about the whole organisation moving forward with the vision and strategy has been the best thing, because what it's added to the mix is a much bigger picture for him to hang a hook on. He can now see that he's making a difference, not just to the customers they're serving, but to the much bigger picture that this organisation lives in, which is the energy sector.
So, like, I think the other thing that's important is, so whilst there's an organisation, and he's leading, this much more strategic focus, his team are actually having to go through some processes as well, to get them to focus on their areas of achieving and what does it look like. So whilst many of them have been in the organisation for quite a while, there's one guy who's relatively new, who's been there something like 8 months, who's actually a business partner, and his profile is fantastic. So he's well and truly a great influence on that. So I think what's important, though, is to actually understand that we have to take that particular group on a bit of a journey in getting them to understand more about what does it mean for them to be in the high in achievement, and what does it mean for them to actually really own the strategies and own their purpose and vision, and the results that they're trying to achieve, and doing that not just purely from a task orientation, but from a task and relationship point of view. So, and I think it's fair to say the majority of, because we had the group profile, it's fairly easy to see where there was a lot of similarity in what people were saying. It's really just one business partner whose circle was really, really, I'm going to say it was really good.
Yeah.
In fact, it was almost high enough to be included in sort of Roma's study that you did here just recently about who are the outstanding leaders. He just didn't quite have enough in a couple of areas to make the 75% across the top half of the circle.
So I think that the thing when we started to work with this group, and we started the process by having them identify what an ideal would look like, and then brought the group circle to the mix. And what was interesting was that the stories that then started to come out about the number of meetings and what it was going to take to shift the behaviour and the thinking around moving to a way of engaging that, in the words that we had before, with a sense of urgency and a sense of commanding. There was also this reinforcement and recognition and reward for doing well in your own area. So the silo mentality about this is mine, this is yours, and I'll look after mine and you look after yours. So that the reward and recognition processes in the past, and what was great was the organisation had recognised that too, and was saying if we're going to move into a way of achieving and moving forward, we need to align the systems and processes to support that. Individual recognition and reward wasn't going to get the collaboration that was needed to move this whole division in a new direction.
And I think it's good to point out that the silos and the protecting and the competitiveness that was occurring between the individual divisions was a legacy from the previous CEO. And so that was something that was, I guess, on one level it was sort of recognised, but perhaps not recognised how significant it was. So this whole process of using the leadership circle has been really valuable in actually being able to identify some of the, confirming some of the things they thought were possibly there, and actually also showed just how strong it had actually been. So.
Actually, Gail and Malcolm, I do have a question. Can I ask a question? So Andy Holly has asked a question, and the question is, how much do you think the profile of the CEO would influence the profiles of the other top team members over time? With a more reactive CEO, especially when powerful, would we see alignment over time?
Is that for the negative, for the reactive, or for the creative?
Yeah, with a more reactive CEO. So,
Oh,
for
yes,
example, like, you know,
yes,
with a
absolutely.
CEO who's
Yep.
more reactive, let me go
Yes.
back to the CEO's profile. With a more reactive CEO, you know, do you think that we would we see any of that alignment over time? Or does the
Alignment.
CEO need to be doing his own, does the
Oh
CEO
no,
need to be doing his own journey?
yeah,
I guess there's two things here. Is that whilst we talked about the CEO being in the role 12 months, he's been in the organisation for probably 8 or 10 years. So he's also he's part of the culture. So even though he's moved into this other role, he also has some of the culture of the organisation that he's learnt over the last 8 or 10 years. So there's no doubt, and he recognises that as a leader, he really has to shift from where he is at the moment. In fact, he was unhappy with the level of his reactive profile that was there, and has really been saying, I need to do something about it. This is not okay. And on one level, he said, I actually thought I'd been working on one particular aspect of that and thought I'd been doing a really good job, but this tells me I haven't been succeeding. So, and it was that was something that was sort of touched a nerve.
real chord.
Hmm.
And so for us, the first person that started the courageous step forward was the CEO in the room. We told you this story, and I'll be very quick with it. In the room, he divided his team into business partners and called them other, and his direct reports, he called them direct reports. In the room when we were doing the workshop, the whole team was there, and of course the three others were separated out. So they were in the room, and they were the ones that had scored him highly in the reactive protecting area. And so he sat down with them right there and then and started to talk about what they were seeing and how did arrogance show up and what was he doing that was causing what did they see distance meaning. So in the room, in that moment, he led by example in terms of how the group was then going to go about doing their work.
and look, and I think what's really important to understand is that he did this out of a sense of curiosity.
Yes, it wasn't out of I'm going to get you.
Yeah, so I didn't see any what I'll class as defensive behaviours with this. This was more about I need to understand this, so I understand what I need to be doing. So there's a real openness and desire to be in the creative space and being in that sort of the top half of the profile.
And I believe, and after we both now coach him,
at the same time,
which is fascinating, but I truly believe that what we were seeing him picking up on was there was a sense of urgency and a real desire to make a difference, and that the first sign of the achieving, particularly decisiveness, he was sitting in the room not saying, I want to fix it and I want to do it now, but what is it that I now need to do to move forward? It got really clear in that moment. And I'm not saying it's not been, roses and fun. Certainly for him, it was a turning point in knowing that something had to change in order for him to come into the creative space.
So, and I guess the answer to the question, he recognises that in order for his team to shift, he needs to shift.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's sort of a really concerted effort.
So that really is leading by example.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's important to understand that some of the processes that have been attached to this as well is that it's very easy sometimes to do. We get a leadership circle profile done. We understand what it is. We work out what it's like. We work out, say, okay, this is my areas for development, and then often nothing happens. So one of the things we're doing is a number of reinforcement sessions where we continue to revisit, well, what does it mean for we want to grow achieving, and how is that going, and what are we noticing, and what are we working on? So there's a part about continuing to revisit and grow and continue to reinforce the need for them to adopt different behaviours and look at doing things differently. And this is an ongoing basis, and it's done within a business context. So it's not just done in the terms of, here's a leadership circle and I need to be doing this. It's actually saying, well, as a business, what does that actually mean for us?
Mm-hmm.
So
Beautiful.
that's a perfect segue into the next slide.
Yes, it is. Yes.
And this is certainly
Thank
was
you.
a great conversation for the three of us to have, because there's something really, really interesting in sitting with, well, where do we go? And as the consultants with this group, what was going to make the biggest difference in terms of both the personal challenges and change and the benefit to the organisation? And it was really clear to that group that when we looked at the competencies, and we could have looked at relating, which is the near neighbour to where a lot of the reactive tendencies were, we just knew that, listening to the CEO and to the team, that we had to move to achieving. And so we moved from the opposite, so from complying to achieving was the challenge for the group. And some just delightful examples, very simple examples where we took really tiny steps. For instance, in one meeting, the CEO, another CEO from another division, 2 of his direct reports and 3 of our CEO's reports were all in the same meeting. And we asked the question, so what is the value add for each of these people in the meeting? And it became very clear very quickly that there was not a lot of value add. There was an awful lot of people listening to the same information that could have been easily shared a different way. And our CEO went, I'm not going to turn up to this meeting. So he went to his counterpart, the other CEO in another division, and said this, and got completely thrown when the person said, well, I think that's highly unfair. It's not at all lead by example. We expect you in the room. It's very important we're all there. And what the CEO was very aware of was that the organisation, the system was saying, hang on here, this is the way it's always been. This is the way it's always worked. What's going on? So he broke the rules. He didn't turn up to the meeting, and things are still going on. So finally they could see that the nature of compliance, we've all got to be there, we've all got to hear it, we've all got to make a decision around it, was just so slowing down the decision-making process. And that small initiative has changed a number of the meetings that many of these executives now attend, and with a clear purpose, outcomes, and who's there and who's going to add value. It's changed quite dramatically in a small time.
Some of them even got to the point of saying, no purpose and outcomes listed on the agenda, I'm not
coming. So it doesn't, you know, we're also talking about the personal side. We don't want to lose the development of the person themselves. However, we also want to be clear, in an organisation that is focused on achieving, we have to see the system starting to align as well. Otherwise, the experience is we can do all we can. However, the system will just keep pulling us back to complying.
And what you've done is that you've actually, I mean, you know, we do, and this webinar is designed in this way, all of you who are on the webinar and listening later on, is that, you know, that we did have this conversation about, well, you know, it was an imperative, it was a really important that this business and that the leaders in this business started to step up and started to step into, you know, this business needs to be sustainable and it needs to be competitive in a, as you heard Gail say, in a marketplace where margins are very small, revenue can, you know, is precious. And so whilst the protecting is high, and that by and large has reflected some of the previous culture, as has the complying, the move, the deliberate move, was to shift from this complying and into the achieving. And as you've heard Gail and Malcolm sharing some of the strategies this evening, and importantly, as you will remember from certification, that the correlations between achieving and complying has the most negative, is the most highly negatively correlated to achieving than anything else on the circle. So it's a negative correlation of minus 0.76, which is almost very high. And of course, when we look at leadership effectiveness and complying, we also have a negative correlation, minus 0.64. But the extraordinary thing is that when we look at leadership effectiveness and achieving, so this is actually some of the business imperative and some of the business conversation to be having with your clients when actually when talking about, you know, the where's the skin in the game and where's the edge here? Where can I lean into here? And if we want to actually get effectiveness as a leader and in the system, then achieving needs to be one of the higher scoring creative dimensions. It doesn't need to be the only one, by the way, and as you heard Malcolm and Gail both say, that, I mean, this whole, it's like a spider's web. The leadership circle is like a spider's web, so you pull one thing and it has an effect on others, but that it's also like a rising tide lifts all boats. So as you start to become more competent in some of these competencies and dimensions, chances are that, you know, with great support and with great coaching, which is what Malcolm and Gail are doing with this division, they're starting to step into this and starting to actually gain some of the benefits. And other ways that you can actually assist clients both at the group level, collective leadership level, as well as at the individual leadership level, is to look at the questions. And I understand you've done this too, Gail and Malcolm.
Yeah.
Look specifically at the questions that are indecisive and have them look at themselves and go, how well am I doing on this one, folks? Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
We use these in reinforcement sessions. So every month the exec team gets together and we have an hour where we come back and reflect on where we're up to, how they're going. They sit with these questions and have conversations around them. They bring examples or not. And there's a lot of conversation starting to occur about what's happening.
I think what's been really nice is
Beautiful.
when we look at the decisive ones, one of the things that
Yes.
really clear is just as part of putting these up, they actually started to realise actually there's some things we haven't attended to. We should have already fixed this. It's been going on for 3 months and we haven't done anything about it. Yet everyone knew it was a problem and it was sort of like, well, nothing had happened. This was really important then for them to be able to be as a catalyst to say, so now what do we need to do about it? So there was that side of it. The other thing which I think was really good too, which was as much about achieving results, which was being much clearer about the results, and also because of their refocus on strategic direction and all of those things, it meant they started to be projecting out a bit more and looking. And so whilst we might say, look, the organisation's actually still performing quite well, what it made them realise is that because of the market they're operating in, they actually really have to do more in preparing for the future. So they would say, we're not on a burning platform per se, but we do need to move to like identify the things we need to fix. And so they've really set some good goals and initiatives to be able to get to drive that.
Beautiful. So what I've done here, folks, is I've just taken the questions that are actually in the leadership circle profile. And as you heard Gail and Malcolm, that there are some strategies and some ways to actually either help an individual leader or a collective of leaders hold themselves to account on this. So how well am I doing in relation to this? So here are the ones around purposeful and visionary, and here are the ones around strategic focus. And what that starts to do is we start to have the conversation begins to change. I remember sitting with a CEO once, and he said, so can you tell me what's going to be different? If we go on this journey, what's going to be different? And I said to him, look, I can't guarantee anything, but what I will say to you is that I look forward to having a conversation with you in 12 months' time, because my sense is that, and I can almost guarantee it, that the conversations, if it's working, the conversations around your leadership team table will begin to change. He said, what do you mean by that? I said, what people are not saying now, you will start to hear a whole lot more of things that you could say, I should have heard about this a long time ago, or it would have been useful for me. You will start to hear about things that are going on in the business that matter, that can help you as a leadership team and you as a CEO make some key decisions that are strategically focused. Well, that year they did a merger and acquisition, and it wasn't even on the cards at the beginning of the year. They had previously failed in some, and they did this merger and acquisition, and he actually went on video saying, I am so proud of the journey that we've been on, because we are now having more authentic and courageous conversations, and we are starting to make decisions, and the business has shifted and changed, and there has been a tremendous shift in revenue as a result of that merger and acquisition. So that, again, that's an example of how, focus on one thing can then link into focus on another thing. For example, courageous conversations. For example, connecting dots across a system. For example, hang on a minute, if we don't have the community focus or community concern in our purpose and strategy, well then are we actually missing out on opportunities here? And by the way, how are we engaging with our people to do that? So this is one way of, and Malcolm and Gail chose this way in order to be able to do what they call their reinforcement sessions. Of course, the other way is through the near enemy. And what I've got up here is on the screen is an example of the near enemy. On the left-hand side, you can see very creative achieving with accessing gifts and strengths in the controlling. As you can see that the achieving is higher, the controlling is helping, probably helping achieve those results through the energy that it takes in order to be able to get that. On the right-hand side, we've got what is called the near enemy. Somebody who thinks that they are actually achieving, or a group of people who think they are achieving, and yet others see it differently, see high controlling. So again, the wiring up, the underlying beliefs and assumptions are different with controlling than they are to achieving. The behaviors, even though the focus is on results, the behaviors are different, because it tends to be a lot more about me rushing, pushing, urgency. You heard what Gail was saying earlier on before. There's that whole sense of tightness and rigidness and a sense of pushing through when there's high controlling. That doesn't tend to happen as much, or very, very rarely happens with somebody in high achieving. And so the move is to actually honor the desire to get results. I mean, there's a gift here, there's strengths here in getting the results. And the move is to bring into, like what this leader is doing, although his controlling wasn't as high, but inviting conversations, bringing the team into the conversation about what really matters here, around the purpose, around the vision, around the strategy, around the results that matter to more than just me or us, but to the organization and beyond the organization. And what does that mean for us? And that requires a behavior shift. But if we can actually engage the high controlling into this, it's baby steps to see that we in fact get greater results this way. And that's one of the near enemy moves to assist a high controller to move more into the achieving space. And over time, and this is done to deliberately say this, is that over time and with consistent support and with the kind of sessions that we can have to hold leaders individually and collectively to account, over time what we start to see is a shift not only in behavior but people's perceptions around how that leader is actually showing up. So we begin to access the gifts and the strengths in the controlling to serve the greater good in creative achieving. Gail, Malcolm, anything that you would like to add before we bring this session to a close this evening?
No, I don't think so. I think probably, certainly with our case study, controlling was not extraordinarily high. I think there was sort of one area that had a little bit in it, but it was, I think we felt that it was the complying side was actually going to, because it was opposite, we felt that was sort of the best strategy to focus on. And the
Can you get a little bit closer to the mic again? Sorry.
I think that it was the complying and protecting was sort of the areas that we
more so, yeah. But and one of the reasons that I brought this in is because there are different strategies, there are different ways of dealing with it. In your case study, it was a compelling imperative to make that move from complying and, you know, some of the distance and passive stuff over into achieving. And another strategy and another coaching way to deal is when you've got high controlling, that here's another move to be able to assist leaders in individually and collectively shift. Because ultimately, yeah, I mean, how many of us, all of us, you know, at some level have get hooked from time to time by our default behaviors, and you know, and I love this, and we finished this the previous webinars with this beautiful quote from Pema Chodron, that nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to know. And that's as true for the creative orientation before we begin our shift into the integral levels. You know, that the focus on purpose, vision, strategy, achieving results, when we move into integral, that it's that we no longer have that level of attachment to it. We see it and we can start to manage polarities in a different way. It's almost like the purpose and the vision are set, and now I don't actually need to do a lot of the doing, whereas in the creative orientation, we are still doing some of the doing together, more so than we are alone when it's in controlling. So thank you for this evening. Gail and Malcolm, thank you for sharing your deep insights and for being so generous and
thank you.
and bringing to the community, you know, some of your sharing and some of your experience and learnings using the Leadership Circle, and we deeply appreciate the time that you've taken to meet with me and to chat with me, and also spend an hour and a half this evening. Thank you. And it's 8:30. We would like to invite those of you who can stay on the line to stay on the line and to ask any questions that you might have. We'll leave the call open for a few more minutes and answer any questions. We do have a question from Rodney Howard. So those of you that are actually unable to stay on the line, we look forward to you joining us for future webinars. The next one is on relating, which is on Wednesday the 6th of August, so a month from now. So if you are unable to stay with us for later now, we look forward to you checking in with us again in a month's time. But we do have a question from Rodney Howard, and your question is regarding responsibility and interdependence in achieving as distinct from controlling. Rodney, you're saying you're interested in the subtleties. maybe Pauline, we could open up. Rodney, if Rodney's still there, let's open up and see if Rodney can ask the question himself. Hi, Rodney.
Hi, Roma. Can
How
you
are you
hear me?
going?
I'm good,
Yes,
thanks.
very well.
So I was just intrigued by one of the slides you had earlier on and a couple of the statements that were there in relating to the achieving space were, I think one of the statements was, I am responsible for my results. And then the statement that followed was relating to, always being interdependent. And I suppose I was just intrigued by the subtlety of those statements and the distinctions between being able to stay with achieving and feel like we are responsible for our results, but not to let that controlling element take over when we feel like those results aren't being achieved. It seems to me there's some really interesting subtleties there.
I think you're spot on. Gail, Malcolm, any thoughts around that one?
Yes.
Yeah, we do. I think both of us are probably going to say both and. There is something for me about the word responsibility and what that conjures up, and often it feels individual. And so the sense of I am responsible for achieving my results doesn't mean I have to do it myself. And so the interdependence for me and the collaboration that may take to engage with others in order for me to continue to take responsibility to achieve my results. So I think we certainly believe in both here.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, Rodney, is that for me there's something about they're not reliant on someone else to do this for them. So they see that for things to happen, they take responsibility to make those things happen. And it's not necessarily controlling, but make things happen through others and engaging others and empowering others. So there's something about what they do to create what it is that they're looking to achieve, as opposed to trying to control it. But they take responsibility for doing that rather than saying, well, someone else will do it for me.
Yeah.
Does that help, Rodney?
Yeah, it does. I think it's more, probably my question is more about the interpretation of the actual words themselves. But look, at what you're saying makes perfect sense to me in terms of understanding the achievement orientation.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Any other comments? I noticed that there are a number of you still online, so very happy to open up and share more wisdom and insight. Anybody else? Well, Malcolm and Gail, it looks like that's it. We can call it a wrap. There doesn't seem to be any other questions. Would you, either of you, like to say anything just in closing?
No, I'm good. I've enjoyed it, and it's great to sit through the process one more time in terms of exploring the whole area of achieving. It can be a dirty word, and the gift of seeing it in the circle and in the creative, on the creative side, is that it's also a really important piece of the action of a leader.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'd like to say is that the leadership circle in the use of this organisation has really been a significant catalyst in starting to, I'm going to say, shift the leadership team. There is a much bigger project to run this out through the various levels, with the idea of transforming the organisation sort of across all of its functions. So, and the leadership circle really has enabled that to happen. And there's, I'm going to say, a high degree of what I call face validity, which is what people had actually recognised as some of the issues in the organisation were shown up in the leadership circle once they got that detail back.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing, as I said, your insights and the practicalities of you know, how this translates into, because it's certainly, I can validate that is very much my experience whether I do it on an individual basis or in a group or using the leadership culture survey, that there is a face validity and that people go, yeah, you know what, we really need to be, you know, we need to be, you know, held accountable for this stuff. So again, really appreciate your being willing to share with us this evening, and hope you can join us on some of the other webinars in the future.
Thanks, Roma.
Thanks, Roma.
Thank you. And thank you everybody else. And from behind the scenes, again, thank you so much, Pauline. And Judy was on standby this evening as well. And Adele. So this is very much a team collaborative spirit that we bring the Deep Dive Around the Circle webinar series to you this year. And thank you for all your feedback. We will be making the recording available, and we will actually be sending out a PDF copy of the slides for you. So if you'd like a copy, let us know. Actually, I think we'll send to any of you who've been on the webinar this evening anyway. So you don't need to send an email to Pauline or to Adele. We'll send you a copy of the PDF version. So thank you, and wish you a good rest of your week, and look forward to the next time, everybody. So will we finish the recording, Pauline?